Well, it's a delight to be back. It's one of those things where you have all these flashbacks, after graduating from here that a lot of you will have when you graduate and you come back, and a lot of us are just reminiscing a little bit about when we were here. This is a great opportunity that I have to be able to share something, but it's really going to be orchestrated towards the cadets as we approach, but I really want to kind of tailor this to your needs. I'm going to talk about what I classify as windows on history. Now, for the cadets in the room, I want you to think about something. And I remember someone addressing this with me when I was a cadet. It was one of my history professors. And he said, just imagine that if fate would allow you to be able to know of an event that you were going to be involved in the future that could be on a historic basis, but you knew when it was going to occur and you knew what it was going to be. What book would you read? What jobs would you try to take? What kind of courses would you really try to aspire for? And what kind of mentors would you try to tag along with in getting ready for that event? Well, the reason I put this up is this is kind of a little bit about my window on history, and there's still some panes that aren't filled in yet. Hopefully there'll be opportunities to continue to observe and maybe even participate as we go through. And one of these things I like to be able to show you is that this is yours. Maybe not filled in yet. You got maybe a pane there that could be described as watching what's going on. I might even describe what's going around in the world today in the Middle East, and I spent quite a bit of time over there in Saudi Arabia and in Turkey, where we're witnessing something that's going on in that environment that I say is on the order of magnitude of what happened when the Berlin Wall fell, right? So it's one of these things we were just discussing, that when you're a cadet, there's so much going on in your life, it's kind of hard to find and be able to pay attention to what's going on around you in the world. But right now, pay attention. It's going to have significant consequences in your life for decades as we go through here. But crucially understanding character and leadership development as you are preparing to become leaders in the profession of arms. And that's what I also want to kind of characterize as a theme as we go through here. What is your perception of what it is to be a leader in the profession of arms? Well, let me show you the first pane that I would show here, the window pane. This is when, I'll just use Bob Munson as an example, who's really been one of the key orchestrators of the NCLS for our class, and really was an honor to be able to stand up yesterday to be able to represent our class for the hard work they've been doing. But when we were cadets, it was one of those things where the man on the moon, when that happened, we were watching, at least in my squadron, we were watching it in 1969 when we started basic cadet training at a very small TV with about 50 of us in one of these real small rooms in the cadet squadron. And even then I didn't understand the complete significance of that. But the reason I put Alvin Toffler's book up there, because I read that book that year, or a little bit later, and I got to know Toffler pretty well in the 1990s. In fact, we shared a couple of stages together, and I've had him over for dinner and a couple other things. He's an amazing man. And if you haven't read the book, I encourage you to do it. But in those days, he was predicting the future. And what I didn't realize at the time was trying to figure out on my window in history for that day on how fast the world was changing outside and the gap that was evident in my world about trying to figure out how I was going to relate to that. I didn't get all of his predictions right, and he'd be the first one to tell you about it. But when we looked at that significant event in history, and I had no idea how I was going to be wrapped up in space. I never was an astronaut, but I was assigned to NASA for over 2.5 years, and I'll talk a little bit about that. You may have more questions on that. How many aero majors or astro majors we have in the room? Anybody? 1, 2? Okay. All right. The next window in history that I just might bring to your attention is when the Berlin Wall fell. Anybody tell me what the date was? Any of the cadets tell me what the date was on when that happened? I'll give you an easy way to remember it. Everybody knows 9/11. Just flip it around. 11/9. It was November 9th, 1989. And I'd been flying over in Germany and Soesterberg, Holland, for a number of years, and I had been able to participate in what we call the Cold War then. But when you tell people who are young, you say, well, we used to sit air and nuclear alert. So we'd sit 5-minute alert. You'd be dead asleep, and the horn would go off, and I'd jump out, and we'd be airborne, almost going supersonic if they directed to us in less than 5 minutes from a dead sleep in your skivvies. Now that's a trick. When we had nuclear alert, we had to certify on a target. And later on, when I was able to go and the wall came down, I went to Hungary. And I was touring around some of the facilities there because there was a couple of air bases that I was asked to do because I was the strategic planner for USAFE, United States Air Forces in Europe at that time. And I went to one of the bases and I was talking to one of the commanders and I said, before we even got on the base, I said, is the tower still on the northeast corner of the field? And he said, yes. And is the ammo dump on the southwest corner? He said, yeah. He says, you've been here before. And I said, no, I had never been here before. And how do you know that? And I said to him, I said, you don't want to know. Because that was the target that I certified for nuclear weapons, where we were sitting alert and being able to say, okay, that was the target that I was going to drop a B-61 bomb on if and when the curtain went up, down, whatever you want to call it, insofar as the war was concerned for the Cold War. And the Cold War was not bloodless. We lost a lot of people in different events, even being shot down that few people remember, where we had people that crossed over into East Germany mistakenly and maybe got shot down in some cases. One pilot I know that was shot down and was recovered. And then other times they came over on our side and were almost shot down. In fact, one night I was scrambled. I was cleared, hot, which means you're cleared to arm. I was closing in on somebody over the North Sea. And then at the last minute, they gave me the code to be able to go safe because they misidentified an aircraft. It was a German F-104, a West German F-104, that got lost and lost all of his electrics. So he was circling around, and we thought maybe he was an East German pilot coming across. So it was an interesting time. I tell a story about infrared Maverick because when I was a captain flying F-4s in Germany at Ramstein Air Force Base, we were asked to participate in a test for this imaging infrared Maverick. This was a weapon that actually was a tank killer that allowed us to be able to see infrared images. Now, of course, you get a hot tank on a cold background in the middle of the snow. That's how you isolate that, and you kind of get that aperture and you target on that based on the contrast between the hot and the cold. Well, I got a call one day after we finished the testing from the 4-star head of Air Force Systems Command at that time that doesn't exist anymore. But he said, you will be on an airplane, and just 2 days after that, we were testifying before the House and the Senate Armed Services Committee in defense of that weapon because the Marine Corps wanted the laser Maverick, but this was an infrared Maverick, and the Air Force wanted an infrared Maverick. But I saw for the first time the power of Congress, but more importantly, the tremendous influence of committee staffers on Congress and how much power they weighed on what was decided and what was not decided on who went where and how things were funded. And then the Berlin Wall, when that came down, I never in my wildest dreams ever thought that was going to happen in my lifetime. So again, I kind of bring you back to the elements of what is in your window pane today and what's going on in the Middle East. I bring these up because I want you to see if there's any questions. There's thousands of stories that we all have who have served and even this room that could bring you back to reality, but I just want to make you just aware that these are things that happen in a lifetime, and you will build your own. I went to Nellis and went through weapons school, Top Gun school. Nobody understands what weapons schools is, so I say Top Gun, everybody knows what Top Gun was. And it was an interesting time to be in the Air Force and trying to figure out, but there was an interesting debate going on at this time that we participated in. It was the quantity versus quality debate. They were trying, a lot of reformists in Congress were trying to be able to figure out, is it cheaper to buy a lot of F-5s, like a T-38, than it would be to buy expensive F-15s and F-16s? F-16s was still supposed to be a cheap airplane, but this was in 1981 time frame. It was interesting. The reason I bring the Bekaa Valley War together is because a bunch of Israelis came over after the Bekaa Valley War. And those of you who don't know about that, it was a pretty significant turning point in Israel's history, because we always think about the 67 war, the 73 war in Israel, but the Bekaa Valley War was also a significant element. And in that time frame, Congress was trying to say it's better to buy cheaper fighter aircraft than it is to buy more expensive. And it was a big debate going on. And a lot of us participated in that, not in Washington, but a lot of people came to Nellis Air Force Base. And we argued. You know, the quality is better than the quantity. Well, when the Bekaa Valley War happened, the Israelis were flying F-15s, F-4s, and they had some F-16s, brand new off the shelf. It was an 87-0 kill ratio that day. Not that day. It really started in June and then ended in July. And it was the quality that overcame the quantity by far, 87-0 exchange ratio, which is amazing. So there's a great story there that I might offer to you for consideration in our discussion. In 1985, I was selected as a White House Fellow, and one of those things I would encourage the cadets in the room to keep that in the back of your mind. It is one of the things that they're always looking for an eclectic group of people, and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a PhD, written 15,000 books, and be on 1,000 committees and things like that. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have been picked. But it was an opportunity, and you get assigned to somewhere in the executive department. You could work in the State Department, you could work in the Interior Department, you could work in the National Security Council. I chose to work at NASA. And it was an interesting year because '85, the administrator got indicted on Thanksgiving Day, which was totally bogus, for something that he was accused of doing when he was a vice president of General Dynamics. And the deputy took over who really didn't understand how to run NASA, never really run a large organization. And then Challenger happened on January 28th, 1986. And there was an agency in crisis. And what we see here is an amazing organization that you could talk about for months on how successful they are and how proud we are as Americans for what they were able to accomplish. But on that day, and a subsequent day that I'll talk about with the Columbia, it was not a happy time for anyone who was an American. Watching that agency in crisis and being able to figure out how those lessons learned could be applied to my ability to watch. Now, I was only there for a year, and actually I stayed a year and a half. They wanted me to finish up because the replacement orbiter wasn't a done deal. Those of you who know the names of the shuttles, Endeavour, we only got a couple of shuttle launches left, another window in history. That part is going to close here within the next year. It wasn't a done deal that the Endeavour was going to be built as a replacement orbiter for the Challenger. In fact, what we ended up doing is having to go to the National Security Council with the administrator at that time was a guy they brought back who ran NASA from 1970 and 1975, and that's during the Apollo time. His name was Jim Fletcher. And unfortunately, he passed away since. But he was 72 years old when the president called him up and asked him to come back and be the administrator of NASA. It was an incredible story and a commitment on his part, but he knew it was going to shorten his life. And sure enough, after he finished this job, again being NASA administrator for 4 years, he died 2 years later. But I remember going with him to the White House and National Security Council, and we had a briefing for President Reagan. And it was interesting to watch the dynamics and how it was portrayed. And we had an opportunity to go to talk to Ed Meese, who was the Attorney General. So what's that got to do with NASA? But he was on the National Security Council. And he was not a fan of having a replacement orbiter. He didn't think it was cost effective. So, but we briefed him anyway, and you never know how things can do. So there's a lesson learned. Never underestimate the impact that you can have on an individual at a specific time, and never give up on trying to argue a point. So when that argument was made to Meese and presented him slides, now he's in the National Security Council, and it was interesting to see who the president would pick first for the first vote on whether it would be a replacement orbiter. And he didn't pick the Secretary of Defense, which we thought he was going to do. And he picked Ed Meese. So all of us were kind of holding our breath a little bit. And he said, Mr. President, I support the build of the new replacement orbiter. And that changed the whole dynamic in the room, because we were walking in there, we probably were not going to get that orbiter built. And by him starting out that way, of course, the Secretary of Defense was supportive of it, and then went on and on. So there's a lot of good stories there. Nation at war. Years later, I was the military assistant for the Secretary of Defense. That was Secretary Cheney at that time. Not Vice President, but Secretary of Defense. And I can remember, after we were watching Liberia on a evacuation of American citizens. And then Saddam started acting up and moving troops down to the border with Kuwait. Really didn't believe. All the experts that were called in by the secretary, almost to the person, said, he's just posturing. He'll never cross the border. And he did. And watching that now from a position of a window on history and ability to watch how the Secretary of Defense worked with the President and Secretary of State Baker and General Scowcroft, National Security Advisor, and of course General Powell as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was a unique opportunity to see history in action. And one of the things that I was struck by was, one, how well they get along, because you always read in history and there were not always that was not always the case. But they did get along, and they used to have what we call CBS breakfasts, Cheney, Baker, Scowcroft breakfasts that we prepare, and they would get ready. And to see the dynamics and the movement on what was being done and how it was done. But one insight I'll share with you, and then we can talk about this more if you want, is I was really struck how the leadership style for the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were similar. And this is how it was similar. President Reagan, when he was president, really loved cabinet meetings. And they had like 4 cabinet meetings a week. And that's how he did his business. Now this is President Bush, who's now in charge, obviously, during the Desert Storm War. Said, this will not stand. And he did not like cabinet meetings. He did all his business in the Oval Office. Secretary of Defense Weinberger, and then Secretary of Defense Carlucci under Reagan, really liked staff meetings in the Pentagon. He would bring all the senior civilian staff together, all the secretaries of the services, all the deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, and so forth. And he'd have these meetings 4 times a week. And he had hours and hours of it. So did Carlucci. He didn't quite do it 4 times a week. He did it like 2 times a week. But Cheney, if he was in one of those meetings once a month for 10 minutes, it was a record. And oftentimes he would tell me, he says, make sure you call me out. So we would go in, he'd get out, Mr. Secretary, whisper in his ear, gentlemen, I'm sorry, I have to leave. He would go, because he did his business in his office. And General Powell, there was an amazing law that was passed in 1988, and it was oh my goodness, what is the law that was passed that gave the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff a lot more power? Goldwater-Nichols, thank you. That's why we're classmates. He was a lot smarter than I was, by the way. So that actually, before that time, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff maybe sat at the head of the table, but he was one of equals sitting around. And that Goldwater-Nichols Act changed that. So they used to have, they still do, have the Joint Chiefs meeting in a room they call the tank. And it's just a room with no windows. God only knows why they call it a tank. I never did figure that out. But when the former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs would get together, they'd get together 3 or 4 times a week. And it was a massive amount of paperwork and all that other. Powell did not like that and didn't do it. He did his business in the office. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to that, I can tell you. The disadvantage clearly is that not everybody's kept informed. But the advantage is you can get a lot of stuff done quicker in a more efficient manner. But it becomes a communication problem as you go through it. Something to think about. Talk about more about that if you want. This is going to combat zone. I flew over Iraq for 2.5 years. One as the Ops Group Commander in Saudi Arabia for Southern Watch, and then went to Turkey and was the Incirlik Wing Commander for 2 years during the 1994-96 time frame. I was sent over there after the United States Air Force F-15 shot down the 2 Blackhawks. Now, some of you are too young to remember that, but maybe you studied it. But we had 2 American helicopters that were in northern Iraq, because we would go in periodically, I would too, and land on the ground in northern Iraq where we had the no-fly zone and no-drive zone, really, in the north. We only had a no-fly zone in the south, not a no-drive zone in the south. And it was one of those things where you get down there and you see the Kurds, and the Peshmergas would go out there with the bandoleros, and they'd circle around the helicopter, and you go talk to the senior leaders in different villages and have chai and tea. Well, that was going on one day with French, British, Turks, and Americans on 2 helicopters. And F-15 American pilots, to this day, they have to live with this, you know, which is, and obviously they left the Air Force, misidentified them as Iraqi helicopters and shot them down. I was sent over there to be the commander after that. And trying to fix that and get the morale going again and trying to work the relations was an incredible thing to watch with an amazing team, okay? It wasn't any one individual. But I was actually, for a while there, for about a month, I was threatening to just put a lawn chair out there because I was greeting so many people coming in, you know, and being able to say, okay, here's your escort. You know, they went and saw their French compatriots or the British or the Americans, and of course the Turks. So it was an interesting time to be alive on that and trying to help on a recovery on a very serious, challenging time for all of us. And we can talk about lessons in command in the combat zone. I mean, they would shoot at us, we would shoot at them. There were days where, for instance, I can remember meeting with all the pilots all the time on a weekly basis, and then I would repeatedly say that today when you take the runway and you're going into combat, in the combat zone, you can either be a hero or a goat. Because a lot of those of you who heard Sal yesterday, Medal of Honor winner, I thought that was just an amazing brief. He's just such an authentic, real individual, you know, who did an amazingly incredible thing that earned him the honor of being a Medal of Honor winner. I used to tell them, I said, it's boring up there a lot of times because we're drawing a lot of holes in the sky. And sometimes they would shoot AAA, and I think Saddam just would say, shoot something, you know, and they'd shoot something at us. But it was interesting one day, after telling them that, it just occurred to me, I said, well, what you do could be on the news the next day, and the President of the United States could speak to you about it, could speak about it. Well, that was the day that one of our F-4s went up on a Wild Weasel mission, and we had a rules of engagement at that time. If they locked on to us, we were clear to shoot an anti-radiation missile down on it. Took that sight out, and of course the pilots landed, and darned if the President of the United States didn't say something about it the next day. So a lot of my staff guys came in with the U.S. Daily News, you know, news report, and they said the stock market, and he says, okay, which stock is going to go up? Because they thought I was a good predictor of the future, you know. So it was an interesting, you know, time of being able to balance boredom with significance on how things can happen. A lot of stories there. This one was 9/11. You were old enough to remember that. You were probably in the age of 7 and 11 years old. I was in the Pentagon that day. I was at that time, the Director for Strategic Planning as a two-star. And of course, we're all watching the news of what went on in New York. We saw the first one, and then oh my God, we saw the second one, and then we're sitting around trying to figure out, I wonder if they're going to hit Washington. And not 10 minutes after I think we said that, bam, you know, the bells and whistles went off. We kind of got knocked off our feet. No one in my section was hurt because I was kind of around the corner there a bit, where the Air Force primarily had their staff. It really was the Army and the Navy that took the brunt of the force there. We did lose some spouses who worked for me, people who worked for me whose spouses were over there, particularly an Army major who was married to an Air Force captain who was pregnant and had 2 children. It was one of those days that, you know, just wakens you up to the point where 2,276 Americans, well, 2,276 people were killed from 81 different countries. And it was, in the Pentagon, we lost 125. 75 were civilians, 55 were military. So people sometimes forget that. And children were killed that day because they were on a tour from schools. It was a horrible day. It really was the second highest loss of American life in American history. Can anybody tell me, any of the cadets tell me what the first?
Antietam.
What was it?
Antietam.
Antietam, exactly. It was Antietam. But then we had North and South soldiers fighting against each other. But this was the single largest loss of life except for that one time. But it was incredible stories that go on. And I know you've read about them and you heard about them and you've lived through this. And this is your window in history that you'll remember for the rest of your life. But the power of the American military, the most powerful military ever built in the history of mankind, was awakened. And we went over there, and you know what we've done in Iraq, I mean Afghanistan, and also in Iraq. However you can discuss the politics, the military success of those stories are incredible to study, okay? To think that we go to a landlocked nation halfway around the world and be able to take down the country and be able to do it in a matter of weeks to a month, primarily using air power. There's an old story about one of our special forces soldiers who called in for supplies, because he'd been directing the airstrikes with laser-guided bombs. And even at that time, we had some GPS weapons at that time where B-52s could launch. You couldn't even see them. And they'd call in the coordinates, and they'd say, okay, watch this. And the Afghanis would be watching where they've spotted the enemy, and boom, yeah, they're gone. And they're looking for air, and there's not. So the guy calls in for supplies one day. You may have heard the story. He says, I need hay for my horse, because that's what he was riding. I need batteries for my radio. And I need Vaseline for my backside, because my backside's really sore riding this horse, So here we were in the 21st century, effectively, on the brink of it, being able to use resources that combined amazing technology with the ability of somebody riding a horse. By the way, the story you may not know about the Pentagon that I was really impressed with, and this is one of those civilian stories, the contractors who rebuilt the Pentagon after it was damaged made a commitment that they would have that thing fixed a year to the day, to the moment, to the minute after 9/11. And they did. They worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day to make that happen. And it was a section of the Pentagon that actually had been remodeled just years before. And it actually was one that didn't have the asbestos in it. If they'd hit another part of the building, we might not have been able to reoccupy that because of the asbestos challenge. But we were back in the Pentagon the next morning working, even though there was a fire in the Pentagon that burned for 10 days. It was one of those electric fires they couldn't quite find, but the smoke and the fumes were still there. But we were in the Pentagon working the next day, and that's another credit to the character of the American military. Then we come to Columbia, and I'll pretty much close on this a little bit. So now it's 2003 in January. And I get a call on Saturday after Columbia broke up on reentry. And on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, I was looking at debris in Nacogdoches, Texas. And you lived through this. This is another window on your history and understanding the significance of what happened on this accident. Now, one of the lessons learned that I will always tell you to try to kind of put back in your memory is complex systems fail in complex ways, requiring complex solutions. There's no one thing that you get to point to, either because of Challenger or because of Columbia, and say, okay, this is the thing, this is the person, this is the widget that broke necessarily. It was a combination of things. And it was interesting when we did this investigation, there were 13 board members. We had a former Secretary of the Air Force, there are 4 flag officers, including myself. We had a Nobel Prize winner. We had some technical experts from different parts of the country, that were engineers and run large organizations. And then I ended up being the executive director for the investigation. It took a year out of our lives. But what was interesting about this investigation is we did something that was different. I'd been involved in aircraft accidents, either in, had some on my base as well as having investigated others on others' bases. And one of the interesting things is we normally find the widget that broke, something went wrong. We find the person closest to that, either fire, retire, replace that person, and then we move on. What was different about this investigation is the following. We came across a study. It was interesting how these things play out sometimes. It was a Canadian investigation of some people who died because of poor sanitation and chlorination of water in a town. What's that got to do with NASA? What happened was 2 brothers were responsible for filtrating and being able to keep the chlorination correct in a town with a lot of cattle, and the feces got into water, and a lot of people got sick. 4 adults died and 6 children died. And it was a massive, crisis in Canada. All right? When they did the investigation, they found the widget. They didn't chlorinate the water. They found the 2 guys who were closest to it. Of course, they got penalized. But they went further than that. They looked at the entire system. And they traced it all the way back to the oversight for the Department of Interior kind of equivalent in Canada, to the legislature, their cabinet, and even to the Prime Minister. which was interesting. We took that story, and that's exactly what we do with NASA. We didn't just look at the technical failure. And I'll show you real quick what that technical failure was. But we looked at the entire culture. So we said there were two causes for this accident. One was the technical one. It was foam that came off from the external tank that hit the left wing and cracked it. And on reentry, that heat, because of that crack, entered that left wing and destroyed the structure, and it broke up on reentry. That was the one cause. But we said the equal cause was the culture, management, and organization of NASA had failed. And that really shook NASA up. And we said there were two causes, and both of them are equal. All right? I use this term, and this is one term when I give this briefing on Columbia, and I've probably given it about 150 times. This is one that always seems to resonate, and you probably will remember it or remember parts of it. Normalizing deviance. We do that in a lot of bureaucracies. In other words, NASA had foam coming off from the very first day of shuttle launches in 1981. Okay, this is 2003. And they had worked some of the problems, but basically they had normalized that deviance in the sense that it's like a Russian roulette with a gun, you know. You go, okay, nothing happened, nothing happened. So next time I squeeze the trigger, nothing's going to happen. Well, guess what? It did. You know, in the school district right now, I was shocked by the fact that when I got to 39,000 students, 56 schools, we've got 6,000 employees. I go by our high schools, and I couldn't tell whether the school was in or out because so many kids were outside the building and weren't inside the building. They had normalized truancy to the point where it's just too hard to deal with. We can't fix it. And we didn't accept that, and we obviously have changed that since I've been there. But this is something that I would ask you to think about, is what parts of organizations that you will be part of in the future that things get normalized. And they say, well, that's just too hard to do. That's part of business. Do not accept that, okay? And make sure, in this case, for NASA, it caused them quite a bit. I'm going to show you a real quick video. And again, I've got a lot more information here if you want it. This is the culprit right here. This is what came off. It was a piece of foam that was on the juncture of connecting the external tank to the space shuttle. And here's a better description of it, as you'll see. This is real time. You can see the numbers up there to describe the altitudes and the airspeeds on the shuttle launch. So now we're at 200 knots, 300 knots. The height is 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 feet. You're going to zone in on the area of where this piece came off. And it was right there. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Right here. And there's junctions of connections to the external tank on the top and on the bottom. This is about 2.2 pounds of foam. And this destroyed a shuttle. How does foam destroy a shuttle? Well, when this thing came off at about 65,000 feet, we're now at Mach 2.5. It comes off in three pieces, two small pieces and one large piece. And the larger piece is actually 1.6 pounds. The two pieces here miss. The large piece hits. But this is the old equation that you learned in physics, force equals mass times acceleration. Everything has mass, even foam. 1.2 pounds of force ended up having 500 pounds of pressure put on that left wing. And it cracked it. And it cracked it to the point where it didn't affect them on launch, because at launch you're going to cooler and cooler climates, and it's less and less of a structure because you're going out into space and you have less and less molecules hitting it. But that particular thing on foam, when I flew F-16s, you know, we'd be flying along, and if you took a 1 to 2 pound bird that hit you in the wrong place in the canopy, that could ruin your day just by a small bird. If you're going 500, 600, 700 miles an hour at low altitude, as a case in point. The solid rocket motors are ejected at 2 minutes after launch. This is sped up, and at 8.5 minutes up here, you'll see it rolls back up and it jettisons the external tank, which doesn't have any fuel in it anymore. And this goes on reentry and burns up on reentry. The solid rocket motors actually are recovered with parachutes, refurbished, and used again. I want to show you real quick the reentry. And this is animated too. A lot more information on this should you have any questions. working. See what happens there. Well, this is 8:44 in the morning, and Columbia makes its entry. It's pretty much over Australia, and it actually flies backwards and upside down. You may not know that. It flies upside down because it's a lot hotter when it's facing the sun, and it flies upside down because if it hits any small meteorites that might be up there that we can't see, it'll damage the back of the aircraft, spacecraft, but we don't care about that anymore because effectively it's a glider. But if it hits the front part, it could damage the canopy, and then we could lose the crew that way. So it does a split S, we call it, makes the reentry. And then coming back in, the crew did not know they had a problem. They were told that this foam had come off, but the analysis, the previous and preliminary analysis was it was not a hard hit. It was more like a skip hit, like you throw a rock on water. Low angle of incidence, low impact angle, and low force, when in fact that was not true. And we ended up coming in on reentry, 10,000 degrees, started eating away at that crack, and that heat just went into it. There was no explosion. You don't have explosions in space. Some nutcase in Israel, I think, if I remember right, had drawn this thing, a big explosion in space, saying that was a real shuttle that he had a picture of, which was not true. And so we ended up having this heat that ate away into that crack and eventually got into even where the left wheel well was and destroyed the structure inside the left wing. And that's what failed, and we lost the crew at about 200,000 feet and about Mach 9. All right. We were just talking a little bit earlier that, what was it that was here that you looked at? Oh, it was a flag that was flown on Challenger, okay, that they were recovered. We recovered a whole bunch of debris from the shuttle. I'll just show you that. This is the flight path over Texas. You can see where it is in relation to Dallas. If it had been a little bit different out, we would have had a lot worse case. Do you know that any piece of debris that came off of the Columbia didn't hit a house, didn't hit a car, didn't hit a human? Not one single piece that came off of that massive space shuttle. It really was a gift from God. And this is the debris that we were able to do, put it together. I mean, the engineers are amazing on how they were able to put things together. They could find a small piece the size of a nickel, and they would tell you it fit right there. It was an incredible feat of a year-wide investigation to be able to figure out what it was that caused the accident. And then those were the technical causes that we figured. They were aerodynamic proof, thermodynamic timelines, imagery, debris evidence that we were able to put together that conclusively allowed us to come to the conclusion that it was the foam that caused the accident and was the reason for the loss of the crew. A lot more stories there that I would invite you to ask about, and then I'll just end up with this, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm now in another phase of my life, and then I chose to go back to education. I didn't even know it was possible to be a superintendent of schools. Now, you are a lot closer as cadets to just finishing high school within the last 3 to 4 years or earlier. But I want to put in your head that the 21st century issue of education is really a national security issue, and it is a civil rights issue. And being able to make sure that we are, in fact, paying attention to that we are building students in the future that are globally competitive, that can have an opportunity to be in the military, to be in shape to be in the military, to have the knowledge and skills like you have to be accepted into schools like the Academy or any of our other academies around the country, in ROTC or OTS. And then the civil rights issue is, it truly is an effect of giving every child an opportunity to have an education. So when I say that I had the honor and the privilege to help defend this nation with millions of other people, I now have the honor and privilege of helping to defend the right of every child to learn. And ending with the issue of trying to make sure that they are truly competitive. All right, it's a lot. I've given you, hopefully, things that you can think about, but you will build your own windows in history. You will participate however little or however large And you will have, I guarantee, a time when you are going to be challenged with some kind of effort that you're going to have to rely on every single one of your resources and your knowledge base and your instincts to be able to make the right decision in the moment. Now, some of you may know the fact that our classmate is Sully Sullenberger. Now, Sully and I were soaring instructors here at the academy. There was a lot smaller program in those days, and we only had 12 instructor pilots. And he was one, I was one, and we had 10 others. And I can almost assure you, I haven't spoken to Sully except on the phone, but we were reminiscing about our time as glider pilots and being able to make decisions. But I know that this amazing American had trained his entire life for that moment, and being able to save those people, and what a great day for America to be able to see that happen. You know, if he had landed at a higher angle of attack, he probably would have broken off the tail. If he had landed at a lower angle of attack, the weight of the water scooping in on the engines probably would have ripped the engines apart. In any event, those two cases would have resulted in that airplane sinking. But he put it exactly where he needed at the right angle of attack and be able to set that thing down. Ladies and gentlemen, that's your example of someone who had windows of history and was prepared for that one moment when that decision had to be made. Thank you very much. Good. So what questions can I answer for you on anything we've covered? We can go deeper into any of those areas. By the way, I've been authorized by the superintendent that the first cadet who asks a question gets a day off. You know that. Yeah. He doesn't know that, but I know that. Please.
Could you explain some of the...
Doesn't apply to lieutenant colonels, by the way. You don't get a day off. Could
you explain some of the normalizing deviants that you uncovered in the management and the leadership of NASA, not necessarily just down to technical folks who were analyzing the falling debris?
You know, it was interesting that NASA had gotten to a point where they were operationalizing a lot of what they were doing. It was a little bit of Challenger occurred in 1986. And just as a side note, I would offer you one other big lesson. You've got to be a continual learner. When I was interviewing astronauts and the senior executive members of NASA, as we all were as part of the team, I was struck by the fact that no one, not one single executive at NASA. Now you can remember in '86 they were young pups. This is 2003. They're now in charge of NASA. None of them had done a case study on Challenger. Not one. And the Navy, to their credit, every nuclear Navy officer for the last, since 1986, has done a case study on Challenger. And that one senior executive at NASA had done, and it was kind of a psychological thing for them. It was a little bit, and it really was demonstrated that when they collected the debris from Challenger that was washed off on shore and they were able to collect from the water, this is 1986, they put it in a silo and they put a cover on it. It was almost like, okay, we got that, it's behind us, and we move forward. So now 2003, it's a little bit of this normalizing elements where we've been there, we've done that, we've got the T-shirt. And I was struck by the fact they weren't always considering the fact, even as a novice in the sense of dealing with these experts in space, that they were treating it more as an operational element. There was actually conversations that they were going to transfer over the operation to industry and let them run it. I mean, people were talking about, well, this is like an airline now. Well, an airline lands, you get 6 people, they refuel it, they replenish it, pilots get in, they fly. A shuttle, this was, originally the shuttle had planned to fly 100 missions per shuttle in 10 years. That was 10 a year. I mean, we didn't even come close to that. And, but it got to a point now in the psyche of NASA that they were normalizing the fact that this was an operational kind of mission, and it wasn't an R&D. But in truth of fact, what became very evident to all of us, that every time that shuttle launched, it came back different. It was aged. It had more exposure to oxidation. It had more elements that were introduced that hadn't been introduced before. And this was not a mission, Columbia was not a mission to the space station. And here's the second thing they kind of normalized in a way, was they treated the missions that were not to the space station as kind of, oh, we've been there. This was a scientific mission around the planet. If you were an astronaut and they said, okay, which mission do you want? You raise your hand, you want to go to the space station. That was the sexy mission, that was the harder mission, that was the one that was going to the future. The last one you want to do is go, oh, just fly around the planet with a space, you know, kind of experimentation lab in the back. And it got postponed 3 times. Normally a crew is brought together and they're trained. They go to the simulator repeatedly. They got priority on the airplanes, T-38s or the shuttle simulator, you know, the G3 or G2 that they use to fly in. They got priority. And then you fly in within 6 months. This was a year and a half later because they got bumped a few times. So it was an issue of antennas came down. They normalized the fact that it was an operational mission. And I was struck by the fact that when we assembled the decision team, I said, I want to see the whole thing. I want to see all the people sitting in their places on the day that the decision was made that they could make the reentry. Okay, not launch, but the reentry. And one thing that struck me right away, I said, where's the safety person? And the safety person was in the 3rd row on the cheap seats. And if you're going to equate it to the military, I would say this guy was a staff sergeant and there was a general sitting at the table in charge of the shuttle operations. Now, you think that guy back there, and I mean, you have to have a lot of courage to be able to raise your hand and say, I've got some concerns, you know, we shouldn't necessarily let the shuttle come back or without this entry. Now, shuttles can only stay up in space for 30 days. And it's not a limitation on oxygen, food, or water. It's actually a limitation on the regeneration of the nitrogen, okay, in the shuttle. So you couldn't keep it up there forever. But, you know, where's the person that's going to have the gumption to be able to sit at the table, have an equal place, and be able to raise their hand and be able to say, okay, where's that courage, that character? And the system didn't allow that person to be sitting right at the table. So those are just a couple examples I'm going to offer. Okay? Yes, sir.
2 questions.
Sure.
One on the shuttle. When they saw the shuttle go up and they saw that piece of debris hit the wing, was there a normalized or standardized way that they were going to be able to repair that in space? That they would have been able to do that? That they had the, you say, gumption? That's the first question. The second question relates to education. You as an educational administrator, are there, it seems to me, getting people like getting the family more involved, you could reduce truancy, you could make sure kids are doing more homework, you know, getting down to a smaller unit that way. Is that something school districts are going to start focusing on, or is public education seems like they put all of the responsibility on the teachers, and families are advocating the responsibilities, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were about improving education to make us competitive.
Okay, good questions. First of all, a couple of stories on the shuttle. They had used a crater model that was built in 1978 to make the analysis on whether that piece of foam had caused a challenge on damaging the shuttle. It was done by a young man who was moving from Los Angeles to Houston. In other words, a PCS move, kind of. And he was trained on that particular analytical tool by a webinar. And he did it en route to his move. And that is what people took as a definitive conclusion on a PowerPoint slide that was shown by the decision makers that it was not a critical problem to worry about. It's an amazing story how these dominoes just kept falling in. And whether they could fix it in space or not, I usually get that question. The answer is no. NASA had tried to think about ways of repairing the shuttle, but effectively, if you go for a spacewalk, even if you're tethered, you know, you push something to fix and you're going to be bounced away. That was one of the recommendations that we met and they did follow, was to build an arm on a space shuttle that could go underneath the whole shuttle and people could stand on to have something to brace themselves if and when they did need to repair. But that was not available to them in Columbia.
So they had no options.
Well, it's interesting. There was an option. But because there had not been any information that had been passed nor decision made that this shuttle was at risk, even though there was a lot of water cooler conversations on email that went back and forth, nobody raised it up to the top. And not allowing that to happen, again, an element of courage and character. We chastised some senior engineers to have this kind of water cooler conversation, but never really raise it up to the decision makers to be able to say, we've got a concern about this foam. We think, they never thought the shuttle was going to break up on reentry. They thought maybe it damaged the the part that covers the wheel well, because it's sealed, you know, with carbon-carbon sealing, and they blow the gear down because that it can't have any entry points for heat, all right? So, but the water-cooled conversations were phenomenal in these emails. Well, we got some concerns. We want to get more pictures. We want to be able to do that. But nobody ever had enough guts to be able to raise it up to the senior levels of going on. But going back to the point, there was one option. And I truly believe that NASA would have done this if they had concluded that that foam had put the shuttle pilots and crew at risk. And this is what would have happened. This is, my computer's not working here. There it goes. They could have done a spacewalk. There's no arm in here because this had the science module in the back. So there was no room for the arm, but clearly the arm couldn't reach underneath anyway. So if you walked out on space, tethered yourselves, you could see if there was a crack. So the astronauts could have determined if they in truth had a problem. And this is what the option could have been. Atlantis was on launch pad to launch 2 weeks after Challenger landed. Here's what we have an ethic and we have a culture in the flying business. Is if a pilot goes down, we will go in and rescue. We will use resources to do that. We might lose more pilots in order to get that one pilot. But by God, we will make that commitment to do that. Now, if you're the NASA administrator, and you knew there was a crack or there was something seriously wrong with the shuttle and could cause loss of entry, loss of shuttle on reentry, would you have launched Atlantis with 2 crews members to bring back the 7? And you would have had to tether them 2 at a time in a spacewalk to go from the damaged shuttle to the good shuttle. But you would be sitting in a position only 2 weeks after the Challenger launch, Columbia launched. And without knowing what really cracked it, would you risk another shuttle? Seemingly that it would happen to that shuttle at the same time. I truly believe that NASA would have done it. And we would have had a rescue operation, and we could probably have done that. But that was never an option because they never got to the point that they determined that the shuttle foam hit was a risk to cause it. Other questions? One more? Okay.
What, if any differences, did you notice between effective leadership as a military officer and leadership as a political leader, civilian?
At civilian side, so you're talking about the civilian leadership elements? I was, in general, very impressed. You know, Secretary Cheney, however you view him as a vice president or otherwise, I was very impressed with him. He'd never been in the military. The closest thing he'd ever come to the military was he was on the Intelligence Committee in the House as one of his responsibilities. He was also the whip in the House, you know. And he was picked because he had formerly been the chief of staff at the White House under Ford. And there's a long relationship between him and a lot of the people like Scowcroft. Actually, Scowcroft recommended to the President Bush that he reach down to the Congress and pull Cheney up to be the Secretary of Defense. We weren't really sure about him when he came over. It was one of those things of going, oh my God, you know, who's this guy? You know, he'd never been in the military, never served. But one thing I admired about him, truly, was his incredible instincts. He would let things come to the top, and then he would get the recommendations. And he didn't always follow the recommendations. He always insisted there were at least other options. And it was incredible to watch how he would trust himself to make a decision and not be forced by the system to necessarily go that way. I'll give you a case in point, and this is just an issue. General Powell was down in the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff office and working with the Joint Staff trying to resolve and develop what we were doing, getting ready for Desert Storm. And Cheney was getting a little impatient, and I got my hand slapped. It's in a book, couple of these books, but by the chairman about kind of going around and trying to find out what was going around. And the vice chairman of the Joint, another military assistant who was Admiral Owens, said, well, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it smarter this time. So we did it again. But anyway, we got information up, and actually a recommendation that was being developed was to pretty much go up the middle like we did in Iraqi freedom, all right? But, you know, he wanted to see other options, and this is where the Hail Mary kind of came. The original idea did not come from the Joint Staff. It really came from the Secretary of Staff. And it was interesting to see. It was a retired 3-star Marine general who was working in the Secretary of Staff. But he was open to ideas. He wasn't just, you know, so pig-headed that his way was the only way. But at the same time, he would allow people to entertain different options. I think we've seen that in history with other presidents and other Secretary of Defenses, where they've allowed themselves to be able to have folks who can go about providing different kinds of inputs. But overall, I was very impressed. I was impressed with the camaraderie and the relationship between Cheney, Baker, and Scowcroft and how that worked. So a lot more there, but I know we're running out of time, and I'm getting the message here. So ladies and gentlemen, hopefully that helped. It's something to think about as you develop your character and your ethics development as you go through, but there are a lot of challenges for the future. You are going to be the leaders that do that. I envy you for being able to go on this journey, but be prepared. Thank you very much.